Have you ever heard of a book that kind of haunts the edges of the Bible? Some people call it a lost chapter, a text that was once a really big deal, but then, poof, it was pushed aside. Well, today we're talking about that book, the Book of Enoch. And here's the real mystery, right? We're talking about a book that was actually quoted by the apostles. It was clearly known to the guys writing the New Testament. So why on earth was it ultimately rejected by the church? What was so dangerous about it? Okay, so to really get why Enoch got the boot, you gotta remember that the Bible didn't always exist as the single book we have today. Not even close. In the early days of the church, there was no official collection of scripture. It was a time of really intense, fierce debate, where believers were trying to figure out the absolute core of their faith. Yeah, the Bible didn't just drop out of the sky, perfectly formed. It was forged over centuries. In that first century, you just had all these different apostolic writings floating around. Then, for the next couple hundred years, the early church fathers argued back and forth about which texts were legit. It really wasn't until councils like Laodicea in the 4th century that we start seeing official lists take shape. And that process, it kept going all the way to the Protestant Reformation. So what was the big deal with this book? What was inside it that caused so much drama? Well, we're about to dive into the absolutely explosive content of the Book of Enoch. And it's a wild story of rebellious angels, monstrous giants, and knowledge that was supposed to stay forbidden. The story basically takes a couple of really mysterious verses from Genesis and just blows them up into this massive, epic saga. In Enoch's telling, 200 fallen angels, called the Watchers, come down to Earth. And they don't just watch, oh no. They take human wives, and their kids are the Nephilim, a race of actual giants. But it gets crazier. They taught humanity all this forbidden knowledge, how to make weapons, sorcery, even advanced metallurgy. According to this book, this rebellion by the angels is the real origin of all the evil in the world. And that quote right there, that gets to the absolute heart of the problem for the early church. The origin of evil lies in an angelic sin. See, this was a direct challenge to what was becoming the official story. The orthodox view was that humanity's own mistake, Adam and Eve in the garden, was the source of all sin. Enoch comes along and points the finger somewhere else entirely. It completely shifts the blame. As you can probably imagine, this idea was a total theological bombshell. It created a massive split in the early church. And we're not talking about a minor disagreement here. This was a full-blown debate over the very nature of sin, of angels, and what should and shouldn't be considered sacred scripture. So you ended up with these two really strong camps. On one side, you had influential guys like Tertullian who loved the book. They argued, hey, it's quoted right in the New Testament in the Epistle of Jude. Plus, it finally explains those weird verses in Genesis. But the opposition was just as fierce. They'd point out that Enoch was never part of the original Hebrew canon. They were also super wary of its bizarre ideas about the cosmos. And at the end of the day, it was rejected by theological heavyweights like Augustine. And man, Augustine, he did not pull any punches. He pretty much dismissed the stories of giants whose fathers were not men as just fables. He flat out said that any smart person would judge the book to be not genuine. For Augustine and a lot of others, the sheer weirdness of the whole thing was a giant red flag that it just couldn't be divinely inspired. So, with all this chaos and intense debate swirling around, how did the early church leaders finally draw the line? How did they decide what was in and what was out? Well, it wasn't just based on who shouted the loudest. They eventually developed a formal set of criteria to create one single authoritative collection of scripture. It basically came down to 3 key tests. First, apostolic origin. Was it actually written by an apostle or someone who knew an apostle? Second, theological consistency. Did its teachings line up with the core beliefs that were already widely accepted? And third, widespread acceptance. Was this book being used and seen as scripture by churches all over the place or just in a few pockets? And when you hold the Book of Enoch up to those 3 tests, well, it failed on all 3 counts. Nobody knew who really wrote it. It sure wasn't the original Enoch from before the flood. Its theology, especially that whole origin of sin thing, was really questionable. And while some churches loved it, its acceptance was nowhere near universal. So the verdict came down, and the book was out. But here's the thing. Even though it was formally rejected, the Book of Enoch wasn't just forgotten. Its echo has been bouncing through history ever since. I mean, the rejection was pretty total. The Jewish canon, which is the foundation of the Old Testament, never had it. Major church councils, like Laodicea, made a point to leave it off their official lists. Fast forward a few centuries, and the Protestant reformers looked at it again and said, yeah, no. Today, scholars call it pseudepigraphical, which is a fancy way of saying it's a work of historical fiction written under a famous person's name to give it more weight. And yet, after all of that, the story still isn't over. In a really fascinating twist of history, the Book of Enoch survived. It is still part of the official biblical canon for one of the oldest Christian communities in the entire world, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. For them, it's not a lost book at all. It's scripture. This leads us with one last huge question to chew on. When the early church leaders made their decision, what was the real danger? Was it the wild content of the book itself? The angels, the giants, the secret knowledge? Or was the real threat about interpretation? The fear that this different story could challenge the unified, orthodox faith they were working so hard to build? It's a timeless question, really, about where we all draw the